Our first three panels, excellent as they all were very grounded in the here and now and in this political moment. This panel will be that to some extent, but it's also going to be the complete opposite of that in many ways, because we're going to talk about some history, we're going to talk about some political science, and we're going to be imaginative about democracy's better future and how we can do democracy better. So I want to start like this. We all went to school. We were all taught about American democracy and how it was built and what its principles were. And we all just assumed that that's what democracy was, because that's what it was to us when we were kids. But is it? There are a lot of democracies out there in the world. They do it differently. They have a lot of different systems. They have a lot of different ways they elect people. They have a lot of different principles upon which they're built. So we're going to try to talk about that sort of thing a little bit tonight. So here, I want to begin like this with David Daley, who is the author of Ratf. I won't say it, but I don't know how you got that published, but I read the book and I've reviewed the book, and it's a fantastic book, and he's a real expert on these things. So let me start with David, and then we'll go down the line to Michael Lee, Senior Counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice, who's just a fantastic expert on all these things, and Eddie Glaude from Princeton, the Professor of African American Studies, whom I'm sure you all know, whom I saw on Morning Joe this morning wearing that tie. Have you taken it off at all? Or? I'm so grateful you're all here. Why do we have a two-party system in the United States? Not everybody has a two-party system. Is it written in stone that a democracy has to have a two-party system? David Daley, tell people what Duverger's law is.
Duverger's law. I am glad I have a political science degree. And my 11-year-old son is here, whose birthday it is today, who was waiting for his dad to talk about Duverger's law. That's how everybody lives the dream of spending their birthday, right? Duverger was a French political scientist, and really what he recognized is that the system in which we vote becomes the strongest influence on the number of parties that you have in a democracy. So in turn, really that also shapes the very essence of representation. And so in a plurality, winner-takes-all system like our own, particularly the way that we elect our Congress and state legislatures around the country from single-member districts, really what that ends up leading to when you have a winner-takes-all system is that people become nervous about not voting for one of the two major parties because, as we've seen whether in Florida in 2000 or whether we saw in Iowa and New Hampshire with folks trying to elbow Republicans out of the race, what you might do is end up helping elect somebody who you like the least by voting for the person who you like the most. And so the nature of our system in many ways leads to fewer parties. It makes it harder to translate support into seats in a winner-takes-all system like that. If you have 50% plus one, or sometimes less than that, right? You end up with 100% of the seats and of the power. And so when you combine Duverger's law with Elbridge-Gerry's law, especially the way that Elbridge-Gerry's operatives these days are able to work, and you can combine single-member winner-takes-all districts drawn to ensure that one party wins, you distort the nature of representation even more.
Michael Lee, do you think that having a strict two-party system as we do exacerbates political polarization at all, or do you think that's due to other factors?
Well, I think it can. I mean, I'm not sure I buy the fact that we have two parties. Part of it is also how we nominate the candidates, right? We, in our country, we use primaries. Primaries tend to be very low turnout affairs. And because of gerrymandering, the primary is oftentimes the decisive race, right? Right now, there are only about 24 races that are rated as true toss-ups out of 435 in the House. And a few more if you add in the leans, but really not a lot is competitive. So for most of us, including in Brooklyn where I live, the primary is the deciding race, and we know for a fact that primary electorates in both parties, but particularly in the Republican Party, tend to be very much more extreme on issues. And if that's who you're going for, then that's sort of they're the deciders, and the rest of us are just along for the ride. And so that I think it can influence it. I think part of it also is I have my own thesis that a lot of the polarization in our country is driven by the fact that 40% of the country now lives in the South, right? The South is the largest region in the country. If you go back to 1950, at the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, the South, the Northeast, and the Midwest were all about the same size. The South has just grown explosively. It continues to grow. In last year, 100% of the growth of the country was in the South. 4 states, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida, account for 90% of the population gains in the country. And the South is just a very different country within a country. So I do think having more choices might be a good thing. I think why we, but I think the polarization question is a little complicated.
Certainly. Eddie, what are your thoughts here?
Ditto.
Yeah.
First of all, it's a delight to be here with you guys. The conversation has been wonderful, and so I'm really, really honored to be a part of it. I think we also just need to add another element. What happens when corporate capture? How do we think about the role of money and how it makes it very difficult to differentiate what the two parties stand for, when in fact we could easily make certain sorts of claims that although there's certain sorts of differences that could be identified between two parties, but there's underlying similarities in relation to their response to corporate money and corporation interest and aims and the like. And that can have a distorting effect on the way in which democracy functions, the way in which representation happens, right? So outsized money and its influence can distort the way in which two parties can function. And if you don't have other options, then you're caught.
I want to raise another issue that people who talk about this subject sometimes talk about. The size of our House of Representatives. Any of you ever given this any thought? It's 435. You know how long it's been 435? A little bit more than a century. It expanded from 1789 through 1920-ish. Dave knows the exact year, I'm sure, with censuses, because that's what the Constitution said it should do. It should grow. It hasn't grown since the 1920s. A member of Parliament in Britain represents about 100,000, 110,000 constituents. A member of the United States House of Representatives represents about 700,000. A lot of people think we should expand the size of the House of Representatives. Talk about this, David, and tell people why that might make a difference.
Sure. I think that when you have gone that long without increasing the size of the House, what we've done really is change the essence of representation. Right now, it's really, I think it's even higher than 700,000. I think it's something like 740,000 in some of these districts. And what we have seen in Washington over the course, I think especially of these last few years, is that it is very difficult to get any new blood, any generational change in Congress. And I think much of that has to do with the fact that we haven't changed the number of members of the House in over a century. You combine that with the institutional advantages of incumbency and campaign finance and redistricting, and you get stuck really quick. I think if what we want to do is open up the system, and really open up the system in every way to various political ideologies, but also to demographic groups that are currently shortchanged and underrepresented. What we really need to do is think about the size of that body.
Can I just add something there? I do think, like Dave hit on something that I think is very important, which is, if you're talking about drawing districts under the Voting Rights Act to give communities of color the ability to elect and participate in the process, it's really hard to meet the legal requirements if you have to draw a district that is majority, in the majority, half of 760,000, right? It's really hard. And so, and that's particularly the case in the nation's suburbs, where, a majority of Americans, 55% of all Americans live in the suburbs, including a majority of people of color in the metro areas now. And it's really hard to draw a compact majority district in those areas. And so there's no legal liability. And as a result, these fast-growing communities of color in places like Fort Bend County, Texas, or Gwinnett County, Georgia, just get left on the sideline. And so having a bigger house would make it easier to enforce the Voting Rights Act, to make sure that everyone is there, and that we have sort of a house that, John Adams talked at the founding of the country about how Congress and legislature should be an exact portrait, in a miniature of the people as a whole. And that's really hard to do if you're having these gigantic sized districts and across a number of dimensions.
Sure.
Absolutely. I mean, underlying the question is the House of Representatives a representative body?
Representative, yeah.
And I think the answer to the question is no. And the answer to the question is no, not only because of its arrested size, it's also because of political factors that have led to gerrymandering and a whole range of things, that it is not a representative body. It's dysfunctional. Not only dysfunctional in the way we see and the way we've seen, but in just the very ways in which it goes about constituting itself every 2 years. And I think that question and the answers to it take us to the heart of whether or not representative democracy in the United States is actually that, it seems to me.
Well, that seems like a good segue into talking about the United States Senate.
Oh yeah, that's democracy at work.
But the problem is that the Senate cannot be changed.
Sure it can.
How?
Well, Article 5 says you can't amend the Constitution, but it says nothing about a statute. It says nothing about the great Senate Reform Reapportionment Act of 2024 that we ought to be at work on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Michael?
Well, I think one idea for the Senate that some people have kicked around, like the Constitution guarantees every state equal representation. It says you can't change that, right? That's the only entrenched clause in the Constitution.
Correct.
But you could increase the size of the Senate, say give every state 4 seats, right? That would double the size of the Senate, still would only be 200 people, so a relatively small body. And you could change the election so that all 4 senators from the state are elected at the same time by proportional representation. And so if you had that kind of system, Wyoming would elect at least 1 Democrat. New York would at least elect at least 1 Republican. You could still have staggered, elections every 2 years, so a third of the Senate is up. A third of the states have Senate elections every 2 years. But you could there's a lot that you could do within that. And while having a Senate, you could just make that our PR chamber and have single-member districts. And we can talk about whether they're alternative single-member districts in a minute. But, you could have the Senate be a pure PR chamber, which, I think has a lot of benefits. I mean, right now, Democrats in Wyoming are shut out. Like, they could get 1 seat. They're consistently a quarter of the vote.
I've thought a lot about this. I don't know what to do with the Senate, except, the British had this problem with the House of Lords in the early 1900s. And what they did was they just took power away from the House of Lords. Eddie, what would you do? What do you think the problem is with our Senate?
The Senate?
Yeah.
No, but I understand the quandary that the early founders confronted, right? How do we ensure that less populous states aren't just run over by the more populated states? I understand, Federalist 68, right, that leads to the Electoral College and the like. I understand the rationale behind it, right, because we don't want it simply the case that, you know, the East Coast and the West Coast and now the South, right, dictating, right, the direction of the country. But we have to think about this in a way, in such a way that democracy is actually functioning, where you don't have a kind of quote unquote, at least this is the phrase that is being bandied about these days, a kind of virtuous minority running the damn country, right? And I know at least two things, and we'll get to this, at least two things, the way the Senate functions and the Electoral College functions actually get in the way of genuine representative democracy in the country.
Yeah, let's.
You also could get rid of the filibuster, right? You could also change the sort of unanimous consent rule. So there's a lot of stuff that is within the power of the Senate itself to make the Senate work better, even without doing more.
We're segueing, just 1 second, Dave. We're segueing into the next category of thing that I wanted to talk about. The scholars call these choke points, the choke points in our Constitution that were meant to slow down the process of making legislation, that were meant to cool the hot saucer of tea, as they put it in those days. But there are too many, and with the way things are now, the choke points are really choking us. What are the worst choke points?
I think it's that the choke points are choking us, but also that the choke points have been weaponized in such a way that they are enabling not a virtuous minority, but a genuine minority rule in many ways. And we've talked this evening about state legislatures and about the U.S. Supreme Court, but I mean, I think we've hit on something here with the U.S. Senate. 2/3 of us live in the largest 15 states, and so we have 30 senators. That breaks down to 22 Democrats and 8 Republicans. 1/3 of us live in the other 35 states and have 70 senators. It breaks down to 42 Republicans and 28 Democrats. So when you add the filibuster into that, those 42 can be a choke point of their own. I think in the middle of the Voting Rights Act, a debate, Senator King from Maine said that what the filibuster did was it gave virtual veto power to folks representing 24% of the nation, and that 24% of the nation is far whiter and more rural than the rest of the nation. It does not accurately reflect America.
Mine is the Electoral College.
Yeah.
I think we just need to abolish it finally. And it has a lot to do with, in my view, how can I put this in a direct way? Given the nature of presidential elections and how close they are and will be and will continue to be, given the impact downstream of gerrymandered districts and the way in which inequality maps onto red states and blue states, given the way in which we're seeing these distinctions, we're facing, I think, a legitimation crisis in the country around our electoral process, right? And what I mean by that is that more and more Americans of all stripes are distrustful of outcomes. When candidates are winning the popular vote and losing the election, then they lose trust and faith in the system, right? And we see this downstream in a number of different ways in terms of just simply the execution of the vote. I mean, right now, I believe, and this is just a footnote, we were worried about the outcome of the 2024 election. I was talking to Michael about this. We need to be worried about whether, if Trump loses, whether folk accept the outcome, right? That's just an aside. We have a legitimation crisis, and I'm not just invoking Habermas here, but we have a legitimation crisis that's cutting all the way down. And it seems to me that we need to figure out, right, well, we need to rid ourselves of the Electoral College, which is in some ways deeply skeptical of the power of the demos, right? Not only do we need to do it because of that, we also need to do it because of the threat of faithless electors who might not follow the will of their states and do whatever they want to do. And given our experience with Trumpism, that seems highly plausible in our current moment as a strategy. And when you look at those political actors who are committed to the Electoral College and those who want to abolish it, it actually falls along party lines in interesting sorts of ways. So it's one of the choke points, it seems to me, in terms of actual workings of democracy itself. I have so much more to say about that. And we almost abolished it in 1934 and in 1979.
Yeah. Michael?
I agree with all of that. I do think the Electoral College might work better if you just sort of allocated the electors proportionally, right? If Democrats get 48% of the vote in Texas, they get 48% of the state's electors. So, but I overall favor abolishing the Electoral College for the many other reasons stated. I guess the two I mentioned already are the Senate and the filibuster, right, which are big choke points that give like a small minority outsized, veto power and figuring out what to do there. I also think functionally the courts have become sort of a very anti-democratic choke point, right? You pass things and the courts are very skeptical and they sort of don't allow, the popular will, right? And there's sort of, I don't quite, the courts play an important role, of course, as a check and balance in our system, but the problem is you have sometimes dishonest courts putting a hold on things, and so that is a choke point of a different.
Now the fun part. We're getting down to close to 6 minutes left, and I want to ask you this. You have a magic wand. You can reshape American democracy as you wish from the ground up. What kind of democracy would you build? Would you have a unicameral system, a bicameral system, a presidential system, a parliamentary system? How would the courts be arranged? You don't have forever. And I want you at the end of your answer to append it with, having said all that, here's one thing that I'd like us to do that I think we could do in the next 5 to 10 years. So each of you has about 2 minutes. Go.
2 minutes. Let's do it. I think the key words that we want to think about are proportional and equitable and responsive. I think what we want to design are legislatures in which a majority of citizens with a majority of votes can change the essence of their leadership. And what we have right now at all levels of our politics, whether we're talking about the Electoral College, whether we're talking about the U.S. Senate or the Congress, or state legislatures, or a judiciary, frankly, right, in which 5 of the 9 conservative justices have been appointed by presidents that lost the popular vote and then confirmed by a U.S. Senate that lacks any real connection to the public will. So what I think we need to think about would be the kind of U.S. Senate reforms, thinking seriously, as Daniel Patrick Moynihan said 35 years ago, that there is going to be a legitimacy problem in the U.S. Senate over the course of the next century. That time is here now. That we also have to think really seriously about what we do with single-member districts in the U.S. House, that if we were to think about a system that was more multi-member districts, more proportional, what that might do to increase and re-incentivize our politics and try and take it back so that the virtuous or unvirtuous minority do not have that kind of chokehold over our politics. So some combination of multi-member districts and ranked choice voting there. Something that we can do super quick, I think, would be to go after ranked choice voting for any election that has more than 2 people running in it, so that what we are able to get back to is something closer to majority rule. This is especially important in so many places where primaries are the key, and folks can win seats from gerrymandered districts in Congress with about 20% of the vote in a low turnout primary. It's not democracy.
Great. Michael?
So I have a modest proposal, which is, Dave talked about multi-member districts. I think multi-member districts are worth exploring. I think we could just do something like Germany, New Zealand, and South Korea do and have a mixed system where you have a lot of single-member districts, but you also have some share of districts that you vote for a party, right? And those are allocated proportionally, and in all those countries, they're allocated in a way that you get overall proportionality, right? So, it's a mixed system. And I think you could therefore have the benefits of single-member districts like majority-minority districts and the like that elect people, but you also could have overall proportionality, and people, I think, people have found it very easy to use, and it's sort of produced a lot of flexibility in those places. So that's my very modest proposal of a reform that's a slight variant on what Dave talked about. In terms of what people could do in the next 5 years, assuming that there is the political will, they could pass two pieces of legislation, the Freedom to Vote Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, both of which narrowly came close to passing but failed just because of the filibuster, right? There was a majority in both houses in favor. There was just not a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. The Freedom to Vote Act would adopt automatic voter registration, mandate early voting, provide for same-day registration, ban partisan gerrymandering, put curbs on a lot of dark money in politics. A big reform, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, would restore and strengthen the protections of the Voting Rights Act that have been gutted by the Supreme Court. So those are my answers.
Terrific.
I don't tend to think this way. So I think underneath this is a kind of, underneath both imagineering, as it were, I think we need to understand the kind of moral backdrop of democracy itself. And I think we need to articulate what is our social compact, what are our obligations to each other. I think if we're going to live in a democracy, however it looks, we need to affirm that every human being, if they're going to work, they can earn a living wage. That our commitment to each other is that our child, no matter where they're born, no matter what the color of their skin, no matter their neighborhood, they're going to get the best education they could possibly get. That every one of us deserves a house over our head, that we don't need to lose our way of life or our ability to live because we're sick. We need to understand a social compact that articulates, no matter the color of your skin or your race or your class or your gender or who you love, these are our obligations to each other, and build a system that reflects that. The last thing I would think we need to do, we need to figure out how to connect the metropole to the rural, to these rural communities. We need to figure out how to integrate our community, not necessarily by a narrative of consensus, but by infrastructure, so that if I live in a rural community, I can get on high-speed rail and make my way to a city and have a nice job, go do something. We need to figure out how to connect the country, and then we need to think about that at a certain level. But the first thing we need to do is get clear on the moral basis of our living together, so that we can live together differently and more profoundly.
How about that? And that's how we end. Okay. Thank you. Great conversation. Thank you all.